Well, here we are. We're back again. And this is going to begin chapter 9. And chapter 9 is speech and language disorders in the home, school, and community. And this will be 9A. Now, there will be supplemental information that I'm going to give you that's not on the PowerPoint. So make sure that you have paper and pencil, some way that you can write notes so that you have the additional information, because it will appear, some of it will appear on the next exam, which will be the final. So here we go. As we talk about communication, communication is today very electronic, and it can be more so with email and with texting. And we don't really have to be face to face with someone to communicate, but we still have to maintain our communication skills, because there are instances in which you do have to communicate your knowledge. You have to be able to share information, ask intelligent questions. You will be communicating with parents. You may be on an IEP team and you have to present some testing data. You may have to present performance in a classroom for a child. Therefore, you've got to maintain your effective and professional communication skills up and beyond electronics. And it's almost like the communication of old is almost obsolete. But remember, communication, verbal, oral communication, is continuing to be an important part of who we are and how we present ourselves professionally. As I begin the chapter, Rubin did some research that was published in 2009. And Rubin says the fitness of the person of the 21st century will be defined for the most part in terms of his or her ability to communicate effectively. Now, it's not just our ability to communicate, but it's the ability of the others in our lives, and those that we teach need to be able to communicate effectively. And it depends on intellectual development. It may depend on our environment, but the oral communication that we use tells the speaker something about us. We may not really think about how we communicate and what happens in the brain, and we may not consciously think about our syntax and our semantics, our pragmatics, but those things go unnoticed unless something is wrong. When there is a difference in communication, that's when we go, oh, wow, what happened? Where's the breakdown? And we know that in the United States, about 10% of the population have speech, language, or hearing problems. And it's a wide, vast range of communication problems. If you do happen to have a communication problem and it is accompanied by some intellectual difficulties, it could be a structural problem with the oral cavity or the jaw, but we know that those individuals who do have a lot of trouble communicating, it can impact their employment, their ability to get a good job, and sometimes their ability to pay bills and to be a responsible person in society. So individuals with disabilities many times are those who suffer in terms of unemployment and their future. Communication disorders are among the most common disabilities in the United States. And there again, that is because of so many different types of communication disabilities. More than 6 million school-aged children were served under, and you've heard of IDEA, it stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is a part of what we do in the school system. Speech and language disorders are the primary disability and account for 21.4% of children served under IDEA. And we know that there's a high percentage of these children who we serve in the school system who have a family predisposition for some type of communication disorder. There's a history within that family. When I take a case history, it's not uncommon for a parent to say, oh, I had the same thing. I understand. Now that can be very helpful for the child because the parent understands and they know how to get help. And maybe they will get help for them sooner, which can certainly work in their favor. Communication disorders come in the category of fluency or stuttering, and we've talked about that a little bit. And we know that stuttering is more common in boys than girls, and it has to do with repetitions. Between the ages of 2 and 6, we have normal repetitions. But when it gets beyond normal repetitions, or tension, or fear, or avoidance, fluency becomes a primary communication disorder. Hoarseness, especially in the school age, elementary school age children who I say are screamers, and they abuse their vocal cords and they get vocal nodules and their voice sounds hoarse and harsh and raspy. So we're dealing with those voice disorders in young children. We've talked already about phonological disorders and problems and those treated in the school system for articulation problems. And we also know that we have genetics that play a big part in communication disorders. Now, in genetics, the hearing loss can affect 1 to 6 or so per 1,000 live births. Sometimes that number is different. And about half of those hearing losses are connected to a syndrome or a genetic component of some kind. Now I want to go off and add some supplemental information for you, because when we talk about a hearing loss, we know that children in a classroom that is primarily auditory, 60 to 70% of the classroom instruction is auditory. And if you have a child in your classroom who can't hear, think of where they're going to fall in terms of following instructions, responding to their name consistently, and their overall academic progress is going to be compromised. There is a high correlation between auditory, language, and reading disorders. And you've heard me say this. You have a problem in reading, you're going to have a problem in spelling. You're going to have a problem in writing. You're going to have a problem with narratives. And we know that the higher the incidence of the correlation, the more difficulty children will have in our classroom. Think about this. The brain has over 600 memory skills. And if our brain is not picking up auditory stimulation, it's hard for the brain to recognize and imitate those sounds environmentally, or the sounds that we hear when we speak, the sounds that we put together into words. 75% of early intervention kiddos with language disorders are at risk for a reading problem. 75% of early intervention kiddos. That percentage is very high. You may have a child in your classroom who has hearing aids, who has chronic ear infections, who doesn't feel well on top of a hearing loss. And we know that listening is very tiring. Think of the ADHD kiddos who are fidgeting and squirming and playing with things in their desks, and they just can't sit still and listen. Because the effort, the energy that it takes to listen can be overwhelming. Listening for a hearing impaired child or a child with chronic ear infections or a hearing loss can be very, very tiring. Language processing, that's what our brain does when it receives information. It's like auditory processing disorder is not acuity. It doesn't mean that you can't hear. It means that you're having difficulty processing that information that you hear. So many times we'll have a child come into the clinic and they have an auditory processing disorder test. Sometimes you'll hear it called central auditory processing. And they're trying to determine if this child truly has difficulty processing this auditory information. Then we'll do a language processing test. And I might add it, the audiologist is the one who does the auditory processing testing. The speech pathologist is the one who will do the language processing testing. But language processing involves higher thinking and reasoning skills. It is the last language skill that's developed. It impacts comprehension, figurative language, multiple meanings, because you're trying to filter through holding on to the language. You've got memory skills involved, and what does it all mean, and how does it all play together? Memory impacts academic success. So hearing in a classroom is vital for our children to learn, especially those children who may have problems. I took some of these facts from a lecture that I went to given by Suzanne Foley from auditory processing, auditory memory, auditory language processing, and attention deficit. She is an audiologist locally. I've heard her speak in Indianapolis, and she's quite good. And she really understands auditory processing. So when I attended her lecture, I picked up some of this information from her. So if you hear the name Suzanne Foley and she's speaking on auditory processing, you know it's going to be a fabulous conference. Let's move on to learning disabilities. And some of you may, in school, you may have been diagnosed with a learning disability. You may have had an IEP. You maybe went to the resource teacher and got some help in those areas that were deficits. Now, this doesn't mean that your intelligence isn't normal, because it certainly is. Learning disabilities doesn't mean that you're intellectually disabled by any means. More than likely, your intelligence is normal. But 43.8% of school-age children have a diagnosis of a learning disability. It's a lifelong problem. It doesn't just go away. However, the good thing is you can learn to compensate for that learning disability. We teach in the clinic compensatory strategies in therapy. You in the classroom can teach compensatory strategies. Find out what the child has a weakness in, and let's put into place some steps that they can follow in order to help them remember. A calendar where they're writing down assignments, where they're keeping track of a meeting. Maybe they are responsible for getting the book back to the library. Have them make notes of what is important and what they need to do. We as adults do it all the time. When I make my grocery list to go to the grocery store, I do it because I won't remember everything that I need. That's a compensatory strategy. There is a wide variety of learning disabilities in terms of severity and the needs that children have. What this does is it sometimes means that the school system will not provide direct services because the child doesn't meet the school's criteria for getting services. They don't qualify. And you may hear that. Well, he didn't qualify. He didn't qualify. Well, those are the kids that are in that gray area They're not doing well, but they're not doing bad enough to qualify for services, so they fall through the cracks. Then we wait sometimes for them to be chronic failures, and then they get the services. And you can't provide services to everyone. You certainly, as a school system, don't have the money for that. So parents sometimes have to pick up the slack and get a tutor. Get the child to the right place to get them tested, and then see what the recommendation is for providing help so that they don't fall through the cracks. Dyslexia is going to be the hot topic in schools these days because years ago I heard about dyslexia, but there was never any mention of how we remediate. We knew it existed, and sometimes we thought, well, they reverse letters or they can't read or what is dyslexia? But it was never really provided as a service, and it didn't appear on an IEP. Well, today we know that children in the school system will be assessed and they will be provided with services. Dyslexia is considered a specific learning disability, and it has a neurological origin. There is a reason for this disorder. It's difficulty using phonological components to decode words, how we sound out words, the sounds that we assign to letters, and how we put those sounds together, and we have syllables, and then we have words. These kiddos cannot decode, therefore reading is very, very difficult for them. They have difficulty with word recognition and reading comprehension, and they're very poor spellers. Spelling is really tough for them. Sometimes, and I suspect that years ago, when we kind of were sweeping dyslexia under the rug, it was a learning disability that shows up with a reading disability. But there has to be a specific method for treating dyslexia. Sometimes it was also called that specific learning disability. And is that really a misdiagnosis? Some people say yes. Schools are now legally required to provide services that are appropriate for kiddos with dyslexia. And probably the program of choice is Orton-Gillingham based tutoring. Orton-Gillingham based tutoring. Orton, O-R-T-O-N, Gillingham, Gillingham. And there are places locally where you can get this specific tutoring, but that seems to be the treatment of choice. Like ABA is the treatment for autistic kids or kids on the autism spectrum. Let me reword that. Kids who have a diagnosis of autism. ABA many times is the treatment choice, getting them prepared to go back into the traditional school. Federal law has been put in place to ensure that the schools provide that service for all children who qualify, and I suspect it's going to be a large number. Between 5 and 12% of children in the U.S. have dyslexia, and it's not typically diagnosed until the 3rd grade. Now let's think about that. Pre-K, kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, you're learning those early decoding skills. You're learning the alphabet in pre-K. You're learning B says B. You're learning about syllables. You're learning about words. Kids are reading in kindergarten. And we're not diagnosing dyslexia until the 3rd grade. Well, look at how much time has elapsed when they've not been where they needed to be in order to enter the 3rd grade and read to learn. Think about it. Pre-K, kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, they're learning to read. By the time they get to 3rd grade, the expectation is they're going to read to learn. If they don't have this good, solid foundation, the 3rd grade is going to be rugged. And we see many of these kiddos in the clinic who come for a diagnostic. They come for testing because they're failing in the third grade. Their grades have dropped. The parents are really struggling with how to get help for them. And they're really, really struggling. And sometimes it doesn't get diagnosed until adolescence. They need to be taught the rules of the way written language works. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I'm at that 20-minute mark. And remember, I'm recording for about 20 minutes because of uploading. It takes so long. So that's the first part of the lecture for 9. This is 9A. I'm going to stop the recording now and I will upload. The next time I meet with you, it will be 9B.